with WRAL News.
Good evening and welcome to On the Record. I'm Laura Leslie sitting in for Lena Tillett. The primary election is just 3 days away. Early voting ended this afternoon. There may not be much suspense at the top of the ticket this year, but turnout so far has still been on the higher side. And North Carolina has had visits from both former President Donald Trump and former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley this week, as well as Vice President Kamala Harris. There are a lot of other races on the ballot too, some open seats for Congress and Council of State, state legislative and judicial races as well. And many of these contests will be decided right here in the primary, not in November, because of the way that most voting districts are drawn in North Carolina. Here with a look at the most interesting races and why they matter, we're joined by three experts tonight. Professor Chris Cooper, Director of the Hare Institute for Public Policy at Western Carolina University. Hello. Professor Michael Bitzer, Director of the Center for NC Politics and Public Service at Catawba College. Hello to you. And WRAL State Government Reporter Will Doran. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
So first question to open it up, what are we expecting to see? I mean, I think we're all expecting Trump probably to win the primary here, as what the polls seem to show. What kind of margin do you think we're looking at? Professor, I'll start with you, Professor Bitzer.
I think we're going to probably see it fall into the pattern of the other states, South Carolina, New Hampshire. I'm expecting probably a 30-point margin, maybe a 20, 25-point margin, but it's going to be substantial. I think Trump certainly has the dynamic of appealing to the modern Republican Party base voter, and that's who they want Donald Trump to be the rematch. And I think what's going to be interesting is to watch the relationship between what Donald Trump gets and maybe what somebody like a Mark Robinson gets in a similar county. I think those two are probably going to be very closely connected.
Yeah, what do we expect to see in the gubernatorial race, do you think?
You know, I think the gubernatorial race, clearly Mark Robinson is a front runner on the Republican side. Clearly Josh Stein is a front runner on the Democratic side. But that doesn't mean that there's no storylines here, right? Doesn't mean there's no drama. Doesn't mean we can't learn something. How much anti-Robinson vote is there? I think if we look at sort of Graham plus Falwell combined, if that number is fairly large, I think that's going to signify that perhaps a lot of the Republican Party is not on board with Mark Robinson and his message. And of course, the same thing with Josh Stein and with Mike Morgan. So some recent polling just came out that showed that African-American voters are not quite sure who they're going to vote for quite yet, in larger numbers than the rest of the Democratic electorate. So I'm really going to be watching to see what those kind of numbers look like coming out of Tuesday.
Well, what do you think? I mean, we got a president former President Trump, who only won South Carolina 60%. Mm-hmm. So you got 40% voting against him. We are expecting to see similar numbers here, and also the same. We were just talking about dissatisfaction in the Democratic ranks. Does this mean we have two very weak candidates?
Well, you know, I think we've seen a whole lot of polling that says plenty of voters are not really happy with the situation we've got with this potential rematch of the 2020 election between Trump and Biden. Now, you know, that being said, I think probably, we're going to see pretty high turnout again. And, I think a lot of people will just, probably hold their nose and vote for someone who maybe they don't love, but they think is better than the other option.
What about the third? Is this the year of the third party? Dr. Bitzer, what do you think?
I think this feels like 2016 in that both major two parties nominees were not well liked. There wasn't a real amount of enthusiasm. It was more, I hate the other side more than I'm supporting my particular candidate. And in that kind of context, that's when you see typically third party candidates do well, but it's usually among a very narrow slice of the electorate because of partisan loyalty. It's typically the pure independents, those folks that do flip back and forth. They are the ones that tend to give most energy to third party candidates.
Well, we've seen more this year, I think, than we've seen in the past, right? We've got the no labels folks are going to be on the ballot. We've got, of course, the libertarians and the green parties are here. We've also got various other groups, Yang, for example, Cornell, Robert Kennedy. Yeah. So lots of folks trying to get on the ballot this year. Could there be enough pull off into those third parties, even if it's just a few thousand here and a few thousand there, to swing this race either way?
Certainly it's possible, right? I mean, we're talking about a state where we had a statewide election decided by 401 votes just a couple of years ago, of course, the state Supreme Court race. So anything's possible. It doesn't take a lot of numbers to move the margins in a state like North Carolina, but anybody who thinks that the third party is likely to win, I think, is on a bit of a fool's errand. I mean, it's just the support isn't there, the structure isn't there. Even somebody like No Labels, is it a registered party in our state? Absolutely. Have they run a candidate yet? Absolutely not, right? So it's difficult to win if you don't actually have a candidate.
Well, what do you think this means for turnout, Will? I mean, you know, if we got people on both sides who are not very excited about their candidates, right? What does that mean as you go down the ballot, right? I mean, how does that affect, for example, your Josh Stein or your Mark Robinson or the folks down the ballot? Does the depression, do people not liking it, what's at the top of the ballot, keep them from coming out and voting for those other candidates?
I don't know, and I kind of wonder if it could almost be the other way around. You know, people focus more on the governor's race because, you know, we are going to have a new governor here for the first time in many years. And so, you know, that kind of gives people maybe a little extra boost to come and show out to vote, you know, even if they don't, you know, love their options in the presidential race. They say, well, you know, I've got these other options like voting for governor, there's going to be a new attorney general, you know, plenty of congressional seats up for grabs, things like that.
Well, you know, much has been made, of course, about the dissatisfaction in the Republican Party about President Trump and his issues, his problems, legal problems. But we were also seeing some dissatisfaction in the Democratic Party about the way that, for example, the war in Gaza is being fought by Israel and to the extent to which the U.S. is backing it. What do you think, I'll just throw this out there, what do you think this is, how much of an issue or an effect do you think this is going to have in the votes in November?
I think it's potentially the big question in my mind is the coalition cohesion. Which political party has their coalition cohesive, pulled together? You know, we've got both parties facing some major dynamics in terms of folks are unhappy. There's the anti-Trump vote, certainly on the Republican side, but Joe Biden's age, the issue of Gaza, how things are going in Ukraine. I think those are some real concerns that in battleground states like North Carolina, like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, if a few thousand votes get siphoned off to one way or the other, or folks just stay home and don't vote, that could have major ramifications for November's election.
And I know both of you professors have, excuse me, written extensively or talked extensively about the nationalization of politics, right? I mean, is it fair to say that everything is, it used to be all politics is local. Is it fair to say that it's all national now or international even?
Yeah, I think to some degree it is, right? I mean, you have local candidates, people running for county commissions, city council, weighing in with their opinion on Donald Trump, weighing in on foreign policy issues. Like, these people are not ever going to meet Donald Trump, nor are they ever going to make a decision that affects foreign policy. Doesn't mean I'm demeaning what they do. I think it's incredibly important. Those are the issues we need to be talking about. But unfortunately, this kind of patina of national politics has colored our view of local politics, state politics, and all the way through the ranks.
Well, let me turn that on its head, though. There is one issue that is a national issue that could also be local, and that is abortion, right? Because we're seeing state by state, we're seeing, you know, states making different laws. How potent do you think, I'll go to you, Dr. Bitzer, how potent do you think that's going to be in the upcoming election?
I think it will certainly be an energizer on the Democratic side. I mean, when you have states like Alabama releasing that Supreme Court decision, that is only going to be fuel to the fire for the Democrats to really push that issue and help to motivate and energize. It's about the issue of fear. And if you can scare a voter, that is more likely to get them out to the polls than it is, you know, you support me, I support you, let's get into this positively. It's the negativism in terms of our polarization that really has the impact.
What do you think? Well, do you think it'll matter much in state politics?
Yeah, I think for the governor's race especially. You know, you saw we obviously, you know, enacted a stricter abortion ban this year, not a total ban like many other southern states have done. Right. But in large part, that was because it required a supermajority of the legislature to do so. And there were still some, you know, kind of suburban Republicans left who did not want to vote for a full ban on abortion. And, you know, if there's a Republican in the governor's office, then, you know, a future abortion law could afford to lose some votes even on the Republican side of the aisle and still pass into law.
Well, with that, we're going to go to our first commercial break here. We'll be right back with you. We hope we'll be right back with you, too. Stay tuned. And welcome back to On the Record. We are looking ahead at Tuesday's primary with three experts tonight. Dr. Michael Bitzer, Catawba College, Dr. Chris Cooper, Western Carolina, and of course our own Will Doran, WRAL state government reporter. Gentlemen, let's talk about congressional races because there are a lot of them. We had the redistricting this year that created, or sort of reconfigured, I should say, some districts, and we have some open districts, and so that always creates a lot of interest. And the one I think that has garnered the most interest is 13. Now, you all may remember that used to be a pretty compact little district, you know, under Wake County, southern half of Wake County, et cetera. It is now sort of this I don't know what you could, a tree,
hook?
a fish
Crescent
hook,
moon?
something,
Reverse C?
and that is now safely Republican, and so there's a lot of Republican interest, 14 candidates to be exact. Who are you favoring, or who do you think the top candidates are, and what are you watching there?
Mr. Michael?
Well, I honestly don't know. I mean, I think that there are probably 4 or 5 candidates that could make the top. But the big question, I think, is going to be, when is the runoff going to happen, and who's going to fall into the top 2 slots? I think when you get into these kinds of races, such local dynamics could be influential in a race like this. And perhaps the effect of friends and neighbors, where a candidate lives, pulling that base of support, that could be the key thing, because again, the geography of this district is so unusual, starting at the Virginia line and going down, south of Raleigh. It's really anybody's game at this point, I think.
Yeah, in terms of fundraising, right, I think there's about 5 candidates that are sort of above the rest of the pack. But I think, like Michael said, the question isn't really who gets the most votes. I mean, that is one of the questions, right, on election night, but also, do they get 30% plus 1? That is the threshold we have in North Carolina to avoid a runoff, or what we call in North Carolina a second primary. And so what happens is, if the top vote getter doesn't get 30% plus 1, then the second place vote getter has the option to request a second runoff. So if you were an unaffiliated voter, for example, and you voted in that Republican primary, you get another crack at that just come a couple of months from now. So there's 2 things to watch, 2 goal lines to watch: number of votes and above 30% or no.
And Will, we've got some sort of political family royalty history here, right? Because we got the Daughtries.
Yes.
Leo Daughtry, longtime lawmaker. His daughter Kelly is one of them. The Knotts, Joe Knott was a longtime attorney and here in Raleigh. His son was a federal prosecutor, I guess, for a while. Yeah. And just Yvonne Cannon has been also around for a long, long time. Is this sort of a battle of the establishment folks at this point?
Yeah, a lot of people like to run their campaigns as, I'm going to be the outsider. And it's true. I don't think any of the 14 people in this primary have won an election or held office in the past.
So technically they're all outsiders.
Right, but it's a lot of, kind of old money types and political establishment types who are running together. And part of the really interesting part of this too is Donald Trump has not made an endorsement in this primary, which he's done in several other of our congressional primaries. He's staying out of this one. And so it really is kind of coming down to who's got the most money that, can they put $1 million or more of their own money into their campaign to buy some ads? Do they have, wealthy backers from the community who can, help them out with super PACs? And the answer for several of them has been yes. And there's been, just a flurry of advertising for a handful of these candidates who are really trying to, to make themselves stand out above this very crowded field.
Now let's talk about another one that's also sort of in our viewing area, or adjacent to it at least, and that is District 1. That's the first district. It's been held by an African-American Democrat, one after another, for quite some time. It's been redrawn to be competitive this year. Incumbent Don Davis is going to be facing one of 2 Republican challengers, we expect. One of them is Lori Buckout, who has been flooding the airwaves, we know, here at WRAL and elsewhere, with her ads. And then Sandy Smith, also a local fixture who's run against Don Davis in the past. What are you expected to see? I'm going to start with you, Chris.
Sure. I mean, this is a fascinating race. I think a lot of us have been looking at this race in the general, because it's the only competitive general election we're going to have in the state of North Carolina. Turns out there's some really interesting action in this primary, too. And so Buckout seems like she has obviously put a whole lot of money into it. She's got a lot of self-financing. The kind of knock on her has been that she's not really from here, the kind of thing we tend to hear a lot in the South and in North Carolina in particular. That's exactly right. Sandy Smith is, obviously, as you noted, has won the primary before, has competed before, has been in this thing right from the beginning. This is another really interesting race. There's been some real clapback at Buckout lately from being out of state, some accusations of kind of previous law enforcement violations and transgressions. So this one's getting a little nasty in the primary. I expect the general might be the same.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the same thing as Chris. In terms of thinking about the November election, this is going to be, it's basically a 51-49 district, but those districts really are dependent on who shows up and who turns out. And I think with all of the other districts so heavily tilted to one party or the other, the amount of money probably from the national dynamic will be flooded into that district, because this could be one of the potential majority makers for either Republicans keeping their majority in the House or the Democrats reclaiming it. And so this is potentially going to have a lot of national interest focused in on November.
And then, of course, we have the other districts that we're watching are primarily Republican primaries, because they're primarily Republican districts. Can you talk a little bit about 6? That's the one in the Triad area where we saw former Congressman Mark Walker up against Addison McDowell, I think is the right, yeah,
That's right.
who was the one who was endorsed by President Donald Trump. What kind of dynamics are you seeing in that race? Have you been watching that at all, Bill?
Well, yes, so it's Mark Walker and Addison McDowell, who you noted was endorsed by Trump, and also Bo Hines, who was endorsed by Trump in 2022.
He's in this too?
Yes,
Yeah.
so
Oh,
you have 2 Republicans, with a Trump endorsement facing off against, their challenger who's actually been in Congress before. So lots of different kind of angles and, reasons for primary voters to pick one person or another in that race. I think probably people think that since McDowell has had the most recent Trump endorsement, that he's probably the favorite in that one now. Although he kind of came out of nowhere.
I was about to say he has no background in politics. I mean, at least not public election.
Right.
Politics.
He was a health insurance lobbyist, right. And so he knows a lot of important people, and obviously it helped him arrange this endorsement. But Mark Walker was in Congress for multiple terms, and held some leadership positions up there. So it could be a pretty hard fought race.
What other one are you watching, Chris?
To me, 13 is probably the most interesting. I'll just add to that Bo Hines got the Club for Growth endorsement, right? So there's this kind of natural test of endorsements. What matters more, Club for Growth or Trump? We're going to find out. And we also need to remember Christian Castelli, a 4th candidate, is also in that race too. So could that one move to a runoff? I doubt it, but maybe. In addition, we've got Patrick McHenry's old district, right? So the 10th Congressional District. A guy named Gray Mills, who's been in the General Assembly before, is running against a second-time candidate as well, who's cut much more out of the Trump mold, although I don't believe that he's actually gotten a Trump endorsement. And then, obviously, we'll let Michael talk about Mark Harris and what's happening there.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if the political resurrection of Mark Harris can come back to life.
Right, he was the candidate who in
the old 9th.
Right, and there was the ballot harvesting fraud, right?
McCrae Dallas out of Bladen County, and it'll be interesting. Mark Harris has really tied himself into a kind of Trump-like resurrection style campaign. They're coming after me, so they're obviously coming after you. I think he's having a real challenge with Bradford in terms of that particular district near the Charlotte suburbs, the influence of evangelicals in that district, but also kind of more moderate Republicans. That'll be, I think, a contest that a lot of people will be paying some attention to see how that plays out.
Absolutely fascinating. All right, well, that brings us to our second commercial break. So thank you. Hold on, and you hold on, and please come back. We'll see you in a minute. Welcome back to On the Record. We are talking tonight with our panel of experts, Michael Bitzer, Chris Cooper, Will Dorn. Let's talk for a minute about this Attorney General's race in North Carolina. This primary has been really, really interesting. It's going to shape up, I think, to be an interesting general as well. What do we know? Will, can you talk a little bit about who's running for the Democratic side?
Sure, right. So on the Republican side, there is no primary. The nominee is going to be Congressman Dan Bishop, who's decided to leave D.C., run for Attorney General. The Democratic side is more interesting. There's another Congressman, Jeff Jackson, from Charlotte area, who got drawn out of his seat, is going to be running now for Attorney General instead. And the Durham District Attorney, Satana DeBerry, who is really a kind of reform-minded DA. She's a black woman. Jeff Jackson is a white man. And I think race will be a kind of a key factor in this race, especially because, you look at the rest of the Democratic ticket and, Joe Biden is a white man. The likely nominee for governor is Josh Stein, another white man. And so I think you have a lot of people saying, hey, do we want to have nothing but, white guys on our ticket, or do we want to nominate a progressive black woman for this seat? So,
and we've seen some let's say, alleged intra-party shenanigans here, have we not? Can you talk about that at all, Chris?
No, that's exactly right. And so, I mean, it's a fascinating race. And so it looks like perhaps there were some flyers, some mailers that were put in by Republican-leaning groups on the side of DeBerry. And so even Jeff Jackson himself, the opponent, has taken to TikTok to explain this to the voters. That's a sentence we couldn't have strung together 2 years ago, could we? But that's the state of this race. And I think, as Will talked about very well, race is going to feature prominently in the narratives around this, right? And so it's going to mirror in a lot of ways what we're seeing at the top of the gubernatorial ticket with Mike Morgan, of course, a person of color and former state Supreme Court justice, versus Josh Stein, the current attorney general, who of course is a white man. And so this is in a party that is 40% African American. And so, yeah, it's some really interesting dynamics that I think speak right to the kind of cohesion piece Michael talked about just a little bit ago.
Yeah, and I want to press further on that because, I mean, as you say, 40% of the Democratic Party is African American, but they also rely heavily on young voters, or have for some time. But you both teach young voters, right? You teach Gen Zs.
Yep.
I didn't mean that in a pejorative sense.
No,
and so, you know, you have observed how they engage with politics in different ways than maybe the generations that came before them. Do you expect them to turn out this fall?
I mean, in some ways, it's like Lucy in the football, right? Charlie Brown tries to kick it and gets pulled away every year. Every year we say, it's the year of the youth vote. And every year it doesn't quite happen. And so I expect some of the same thing. I mean, of course, some of them are going to turn out, but I don't think we're going to see massive numbers of young people turn out to vote this round. I mean, 2008 was a little bit of a break in that cycle. So one time, at least Charlie Brown got a little bit of that ball, but the rest of the time it just hasn't worked. So I don't see a big change, certainly in the primary and probably even in the general.
Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree with everything Chris has said. I think the key thing is understanding this dynamic, not just of Gen Z, but millennials as well. Anybody basically under the age of 45 in 2020 had consistently lower than normal state turnout rates. Anybody over the age of 65 now had above state rate turnouts. So this generational dynamic is really at play. The key thing is 40% of North Carolina's registered voters now are under the age of 45. And they are driving the unaffiliated partisan registration dynamic, but they just don't seem to turn out. So that's going to be the key test that I'm going to be looking for in November.
Sort of voter disengagement. Will, anything to add?
You know, I'm a millennial, and, you know, I've got a lot of friends who will vote in a general election, but not in a primary. And, you know, these are a lot of them, you know, college-educated people who, you know, just don't really see the, you know, why they should go out and vote in the primary. But if you're unaffiliated, you can choose which party you want to vote in. You can pick. So, you know, people have their options.
You get the best of both worlds, right? Exactly. All right. Well, that brings us pretty much to the end of tonight's show. I just want to take a moment to thank all of you again. That's Dr. Michael Bitzer, Catawba College, Dr. Chris Cooper from Western Carolina, and of course our own Will Doran, WRAL State Government reporter. So thank you very much for your time and expertise tonight, and thank you for watching. If you have something to say about tonight's discussion, you can email us your comments, questions, or criticisms on the record at WRAL.com. And thanks so much for joining us.